This panel focuses on lessons for natural resource management professionals. So this focuses on people who are already considering applying environmental management programs or interventions in post-conflict scenarios. And it talks about how we can adapt our practices to address the central issue that the post-conflict situation is different. And what are these differences? And how do these differences impact programming on a practical level? Specifically, the conflict continuum. What does that mean? What do we need to know about the conflict in order to know how we can program within it, within the post-conflict setting? Conflict assessments. That's a tool for analyzing the conflict. And also just 7 different characteristics of post-conflict situations. The conflict continuum basically stands for the proposition that conflicts ebb and flow. They are dynamic. Situations change. Sometimes one community can be in conflict and the community next door to it isn't. For example, in Sri Lanka, the Manrakap program was in the community of Santhapuram, which was perfectly safe for quite some time, although there was conflict roiling around it. Also, conflicts ebb and flow, meaning that sometimes there will be situations where you're in a quasi-state of conflict, like currently in Afghanistan, where it's a low-level conflict, but also there are places where interventions are entirely appropriate, or where you're looking at alternatives, such as PRTs. Finally, there are certain junctures, such as peace agreements, that present unique opportunities for peace building. I believe Lisa Goldman and Sandy Nichols will be discussing how the UN Security Council resolution paved the way for an effective intervention on Liberian forestry at one of these junctures. Conflict assessments help natural resource practitioners understand how managing the resource fits into the broader circumstances surrounding the post-conflict situation. This is basically a tool that a lot of agencies do at the outset when they enter a country, but that individual practitioners can also perform a more abridged version of it once they're on site. It asks a lot of questions. There are different methods. JICA has its own framework for this. State has its own framework, and USAID does as well. And the basic gist of it is asking how a resource interacts with livelihoods, how it interacts with social inequality, corruption, governance, and other issues to determine, number one, whether your intervention is going to support peace building, and number two, how to make sure that your intervention doesn't exacerbate existing problems or tensions. Finally, there are 7 characteristics that we've highlighted on post-conflict situations. Post-conflict contexts are different, and those differences do affect how natural resource management approaches should be implemented. There are 7 key differences that we found in our lessons learned, although I'm sure there are others that may be on a case-specific basis. Peacebuilding priorities drive donor and community programming. So, for example, in Sudan and Afghanistan, in the fiscal year 2010, U.S. government funding, the U.S. government's funding for aid in these countries only included only 1% of that funding was donated to environmental programs. So, generally, assistance is focused more on the peace-building priorities, economic restoration, restoring basic services as well, security, governance. So when framing environmental or natural resource programs, it's important to consider how your program will support these objectives. In-country capacity is often devastated. Information capacity, human resources capacity, natural resources, and infrastructure capacity. This means that oftentimes people have fled, so civil servants or technical experts will be unavailable. Natural resources may have been exploited to fund the conflict, such as timber in Liberia. Also, the post-conflict era, during the post-conflict period, people use unsustainable coping strategies that also devastate these natural resources further, which is a later point. And infrastructure capacity is often seriously damaged. As Haruka Sato will tell you in a later point, the transportation infrastructure in Timor-Leste is so damaged that it becomes very difficult to count on being able to get products to market at times. Also, the conflict context is characterized by rapid changes and uncertainty. Oftentimes, there are concessions given grudgingly among different factions in the conflict, and to get to the peace agreement. But maybe the parties are trying to make an ad hoc renegotiation or stall on implementing things. So you're seeing a lot of economic, social, and political unrest. You're also going to see a lot of uncertainty in terms of insecurity and recurring insecurity. Also, all these international actors are coming in and working in this environment and interacting in this environment, and that by virtue of that interaction, also creating new perceptions and new relationships with local actors, which lends itself to changing perceptions of the international community and willingness to work with the international community. There are also a lot of unsustainable short-term coping strategies that can overshadow long-term plans. This can be a perfect example of this is deforestation, where deforestation occurs to provide fuel wood when the long-term viability of those forests and the livelihood potential of those forests can be damaged. Lack of trust and rebuilding trust is really important. Community action may not work without significant effort towards rebuilding that kind of trust, whereas in other developing settings, it might be certain community management techniques would be easier to implement without additional groundwork that has to be laid in post-conflict situations. Unresolved grievances, lingering suspicions, and persisting tensions continue into the post-conflict context. And this means for programming that programming needs to deal with all parties and needs to avoid at all costs any perception of favoritism that could potentially equate the international agency intervening with one side or the other of the conflict. And finally, there's lingering insecurity, and this can undermine programming. This has been addressed with multiple approaches. Specifically, Professor Nakayama is going to present an article he co-authored with Toshiyasu Suzuki later this afternoon on Iraqi marshlands restoration and remote implementation of projects. So that's using a national coordinator to implement a project, while an international body uses satellite technology, external trainings, and other support activities to monitor, evaluate, and support the implementation of the project on the ground by host country nationals. And then there's the other option, which is PRTs, where a group of civilian agency specialists will work with military specialists to provide services while still maintaining security on behalf of the civilian specialists. So these are some of the key characteristics and key differences of the post-conflict context. And I believe our panelists are going to now discuss all of the specific implications these had for their case studies. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alona. I'm Sandra Nichols, and this is Lisa Goldman, and we're going to talk about the Liberia Experience. In several ways, the Liberia Experience is distinct. Because of the historical ties between Liberia and the United States, there's been much more attention on the situation in Liberia over time, and we understand, in fact, that Liberia has been the recipient of the second most international development assistance funding from the U.S., second only to Afghanistan in recent years. But we think that in spite of these distinctions, that the real depth of experience there provides some lessons that are applicable to other countries where there are, as this project is terming it, priority resources that really play an important role in a peace-building context. As we've mentioned, as has been mentioned several times today, and many of you probably already know, there was a 14-year civil war in Liberia. It was very bloody and protracted, and the war was largely funded, substantially funded by timber sales. When a peace agreement was signed, which did in fact not touch on natural resources, and the international community came into Liberia to try to identify what are the peace-building priorities, how should we plan next steps. There was, of course, as in every peace-building context, a host of different issues that could have risen as the focus. But given the role of timber in the conflict, at that time, the UN put sanctions on member countries importing timber from Liberia. And this was sort of a first step in really raising the flag and pointing out how important timber was going to be in peace building. It also, as Alona mentioned, created an opening to really kind of address these issues because the sanctions meant that no timber activities could proceed. So we'll discuss more the impact of the sanctions. The next step that was taken was a series of assessments, which is very important, and it led to just understanding much more kind of what the dynamics were, what the situations were. And in particular, there had been a series of reviews of concessions, but they were unsatisfactory. And there was finally, after the end of the war in 2004, there was a thorough, rigorous review of all of the concessions existing for timber in Liberia. And this review revealed some very interesting results. There were 70 concessions, and through the review process, it was determined that none of these concessions that were outstanding were, in fact, legal. None of them met even the most basic criteria under Liberian law. The other thing that was interesting about this was that it was discovered that more than double the land area of Liberia was subject to these concessions. So it was just complete chaos at that time. At that point, everyone kind of realized that straightening out the timber sector was going to be critical for rebuilding the economy and getting Liberia back on the development track. So international actors, including the World Bank, FAO, environmental groups, Conservation International, and others came together to form a coalition to start thinking about how they could support the Liberian government in making the reforms that were going to be necessary. So the focus of our talk is on the U.S. government-funded activities in the forest sector through this coalition, the Liberia Forest Initiative. Although there have also been many other U.S.-funded activities in Liberia during this period, including on community forestry, artisanal mining, sustainable tree crops, and land rights.
I'll give just a quick overview of some of the main elements of the LFI's accomplishments in reforming the forest sector in Liberia. As Sandy mentioned, there was the concession review, which really started the whole process. And for the first 4 years of sustained U.S. involvement, assistance focused on providing core operational support to Liberia's main forest regulatory agency, the Forestry Development Authority, or FDA. And this took the form of a staff person funded by USAID who came from the Forest Service, who literally sat in FDA's office for 4 years and worked very closely with agency officials on all aspects of the new law. Another core accomplishment during this time was the drafting of the National Forestry Reform Law of 2006 and a set of first 10 implementing regulations. ELI and other groups were part of the legal drafting team that worked within the LFI and with the Liberian legislature on the drafting of this law. And this really got the process going. The law, we're still working on issues with implementation. We'll touch on those later on. More regulations have been drafted, but putting in place an overhaul, a new framework forestry law has really gone a long way towards changing the way that timber is managed in the country. This was accompanied by historic public participation, both in development of the law and the regulations. For the law, it took the form of more informal stakeholder groups that met and provided input. But for the regulations in particular, again, something that ELI worked on with other groups, including Liberia Media Center, we had a historic first notice and comment, first time ever conducted in Liberia. A team traveled out to remote communities and met and reviewed regulations, presented them to communities, and really took community input. And that was really a historic step. And it was important not only for the development of the regulations themselves, but for community involvement and empowerment and public engagement and civic affairs more generally, which is one reason why the Liberia Experience is so interesting and holds a lot of lessons that go beyond the forest sector. This was also accompanied by the development of accompanying materials, codes, manuals, other policy guidance for the FDA. And finally, an element that started around 2007 that ELI has worked on, capacity building efforts, and we'll talk more about capacity building for the FDA staff as well as local communities. And this was really critical because following the war, FDA staff levels were decimated in many ways. The agency was not quite prepared at the outset to implement the law, but has, through these a whole series of workshops, the operational support provided by the staff person at FDA, a lot of progress has been made, and the agency has grown by leaps and bounds and taken on more and more responsibilities and is really accomplishing a lot now as far as not only implementing the forestry law, but also starting to implement the community rights law and other tools which we'll talk about.
So that was the general background and context for our case study, and this is an overview of the issues that we'll be describing that are sort of the lessons or the issues that we analyzed in our paper. Timing and the sequencing of activities definitely was a theme that emerged from our analysis. As I mentioned, very early on, just as soon as the peace agreement was signed and there was enough stability that other people could come into the country, there was a meeting of all of these different groups, which eventually became the LFI. But as soon as it became clear that forest activities were going to be critical, they got together and brought just a wide group of people, including, of course, Liberian agency officials, to get everyone on the same page and provide a plan so that while, of course, each group would be carrying out their own activities, they could be sort of operating in a coordinated manner, and this was very critical. As I mentioned, also, the assessments were used effectively and really resulted in concrete activities. Many of the technical manuals and documents that Lisa mentioned were as a result of the assessments. And in addition, the assessment process also sort of led to the understanding that there was a need to reform the law. Initially, they thought that they could just kind of, that the law was decent enough and that they could kind of respond with technical tweaks, but ultimately they realized it was going to need more than that. Another theme that we treat is the fact that because of the sanctions, there was enormous pressure to get a new law in place, get things done, and get the timber flowing, get the economy running again, get people jobs. But others saw it as an opportunity to really overhaul and really do the comprehensive public participation and, just a really transformative opportunity. So there was a tension between this, and we kind of highlight some examples of where, things were kind of done in a more thorough and complete way, or sometimes where things were kind of hurried along. And finally, we comment on the fact that initially the U.S. government support, as Lisa said, was directly supporting the Forest Agency in developing the new framework and then in implementing it. But in later years, the funding shifted away from this direct operational support to separate projects that relate to the work of the agency, but they're no longer directly supporting the agency in carrying out their jobs. Land tenure policy is another issue that certainly is important in the Liberia context. I say this is the real story because in some sense, this is, of course, land underlies the forests. And this was a very integral factor in the conflict, and it's very tied up with the war and timber. And the solution of that was made through the new law was sort of a fix, but it didn't really resolve the underlying problem. The law says that forest resources shall be held in trust by the government for the people of Liberia, but it doesn't address who owns the lands and the inequities between the communities on the coast and those that live in the forest have not yet been completely addressed. The government has formed a land commission and is reviewing claims. Millions of hectares are subject to claims, and eventually there will be policy recommendations made about how to address this issue. But the fact that they chose to address the trees without addressing the land is interesting, and it raises the question of whether there's still a very critical fundamental issue that could result in a recurrence of conflict. This is another example of something that was an important theme in this process was local ownership. While there was this convergence of international organizations that appeared after the peace agreement was signed, even before the end of the war, Liberian civil society organizations were informed about the issue, were reaching out as best they could from their war-torn country to try to bring attention to the issues surrounding forestry, the mismanagement, and the inequity. So they kind of framed the issue from even before the end of the war. In terms of the way the LFI worked with the community, with local authorities, as Lisa said, there was always an integration and almost a capacity building kind of approach where agency authorities were working with the international groups and making decisions. With this approach of inclusion and local ownership, there was something of a trade-off. There were some examples where things might not have turned out the way the international organizations or the U.S. government might have liked to see them. One particular example is that in the final forest law as it was passed, new timber concessions have to be finally approved by the legislature because this is a reaction to the historic abuses by the executive branch in the concession process. So you can certainly understand why people thought this was a good way to provide an extra check. Okay, but it did open an opportunity for corruption. And finally, there's been, through all the USAID activities, there's been substantial public participation. As Lisa said, there was the notice and comment with the rulemaking of the regulations. And just anecdotally, as Lisa and I have been traveling there, as ELI has been traveling there, we can really see that people are understanding these issues, and there really is a change from this process.
I've been informed that we are way over time, so I'm going to race through the next few slides. Coordination within the U.S. and between different members of the LFI was kind of a hallmark of the LFI. A lot of steps were taken through joint quarterly meetings, arranging offices to be near each other, and it really represents a model approach for collaboration, both between national organizations within Liberia and the international organizations that were part of the LFI. Real quick, another sort of issue that has emerged was how to prioritize commercial versus community versus conservation forestry needs. The new forest law was built around this 3 C's framework. And given the pressure to lift the sanctions, the initial pressure really was on getting the commercial sector going. That was what was required to lift the sanctions, and there was a lot of pressure to start bringing in money into the country. But now there's a question of how to approach the community and the conservation sides of the equation, which are also very important. A quick note that the funding from USAID came under its economic growth objective, which by itself doesn't necessarily imply conservation or community interest, but again, those are key priorities right now, and that's where the focus is turning in Liberia. A community rights law was passed a few years ago, and their work is going on developing and passing protected areas and wildlife conservation law. Balancing power and responsibility. The opportunity that the international community had, the leverage through the sanctions to help get through this new forest law, raised questions about whether the law exceeded the capacity of the implementing agency. There's no question that the forestry law is being viewed as a model for all of West Africa, and it's a great piece of work, but there has, at least in the beginning, was a mismatch between what the law required and the capacity of the agency to implement it through no fault of anyone's, including the agencies. And the capacity building work that has been going on has been helping to narrow this gap, but it's a question to consider in other cases. Is it worth pushing through a complete, perfect, very detailed law without thinking about who's going to be implementing it and what some of those challenges are going to be? And that combined with the shift in assistance away from core operational support to other funded projects. Change takes time. There's still issues with accountability, transparency, still concerns about corruption in Liberia, and still a capacity building need going forward. And finally, it's important to remember when you have so many groups involved like you did with the LFI in Liberia, not all groups are going to agree on the best course of action. And no matter how much you coordinate, some groups are going to take one course, and even if everyone agrees on the overall need, not all groups agreed, for instance, that concessions should start to be allocated again under the law until some groups thought that should wait till a new community rights law had been passed. So this created some issues, and it's important to try to build support for the process of moving forward, even if there's going to be different objectives within the players. So that was just a super quick overview of the remaining issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Mikio Ishiwatari, Senior Advisor in Disaster Management, Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. Today, I would explain case studies of inland water transport rehabilitation project in southern Sudan. Okay, so, first I'd like to explain some background. Of course, transport rehabilitation is crucial for post-conflict period in responding to increasing demand for transporting people and goods, and in repatriating IDPs. Usually government and donor agencies put higher priority on roads rehabilitation, and IWT, inland water transport, is rarely targeted for rehabilitation. This is because even at normal time, in transport sector, donor agencies are allocating major resources for road projects. For example, JICA, we have only a very limited number of experts in IWT, and our transport sector policy doesn't cover these IWT issues. Okay, first, I'd like to explain some history of IWP in Japan. This is a 200 years ago's picture in Tokyo. At that time, they called Edo. You can see Mount Fuji. And this is a river, Nihonbashi River. And as you can see, many ships are going on the back. And at this period, IWT is a major transport mode in Japan, carrying rice, people, and everything. However, at the beginning of 20th century, our government started investment for land transport, railway, roads. Therefore, IWT, inland water transport, has declined. And this left figure is a traffic volume in Tone Channel. It's connecting Tokyo and eastern Japan, recently suffered from disasters. And the right figure shows a number of river ships. And as you can see, at the beginning of 20th century, the number is declining. However, we Japanese, again, recognize the importance of inland water transport as the Kobe earthquake happened in 1995. In Kobe, at this time, highways were collapsed, all railways were stopped, including Shinkansen. It's a bullet train. Speed is over 200 km/h. However, on the day of the earthquake, ships can start transport for transporting relief goods and rescue teams. Therefore, our government recognized the importance of inland water transport during disaster time. They started construction of jetties in Tokyo area and other major towns and cities. They are preparing for coming next big earthquake in Tokyo or other major cities. They constructed dozens of jetties in metropolitan area. However, one issue was found. As I explained, in Japan, IWT is a minor transport mode, and the government doesn't have a capacity to operate it. In this case, in Tokyo metropolitan government cannot operate jetties at normal time. And they locked gates of entrance for jetties, and for people cannot utilize these facilities. If they cannot utilize at normal times, how they can utilize these facilities at the next big earthquake happened in Tokyo? This is an issue currently we are facing. And another example of IWT is 9/11 in 2001. At this event, 160,000 people were evacuated by ferry. 200 to 300,000 people were evacuated by coastal guards and private boats. 2,000 injured persons transferred to JLC. Am I right? JLC. It's a triage center located. And debris also transported 1.6 million tons for 10 months. This is another good practices. After the emergency cases, IWT can function well. Okay, so I would like to move to Sudan case studies. This conflict began after its independence in 1956, and it is said Islamic dominated northern government in Khartoum and Christian animist south conflicts. And in 2005, comprehensive peace agreement was signed. In 2006, JICA started cooperation projects here. And as you know, just recently, they independent as a South Sudan. During the conflict, 2 million people died, 4 million became refugees. And southern new country, Southern Sudan area is nearly 600,000 square kilometers. Population is around 8.5 million. Still poor country. Per capita GDP is only 184. And Juba is the capital of this South Sudan. During the conflict, this city became a totally virtual city. But after the conflict, population was rapidly increasing. 250,000 in 2005, but 4 years later, it reached 400,000 people. And transportation in Southern Sudan. Actually, Juba is a very important transport terminal along River Nile for river transport and connecting roads to Kenya, Uganda, and Congo. In this southern Sudan, IWT has an advantage. Well, whole roads were destroyed, and all pavements were not functioned at that time, and many bridges were collapsed. But for inland water transport, small investment can resume transport function. For road transport, security is always an issue. There are still landmines, and small conflicts happened and easily disrupt road transport. And this table shows advantages of water transport. Cost is cheaper than road by 20%. It takes double days than road, but still share is over 60%. And air, sometimes they use air for some medicines and some emergency goods, but it's not so big sharing. And during conflicts, the government could not invest for any infrastructures. Only 2-kilometer roads were available in Juba City, and the water supply covers only 8%. And these port facilities also deteriorated. They utilized only a natural bank, and there's no facilities at all. There's no warehouse, offices, and safety equipment. And sometimes an accident happened. In one case, because of accident, 15 people were dead. Therefore, JICA supported the construction of this rehabilitation of Juba Port. Okay, so we constructed this beautiful port. However, the government could not operate these facilities. Just after the conflict, government has a very limited capacity. Even these simple facilities, they could not operate. Therefore, we started an additional project for capacity development. This figure shows JICA's concept of capacity development. For the last 2 or 3 decades, we supported capacity development in developing countries. Based on such experiences, we are targeting 3 levels. First one is society level, second one is organization level, and third one is individual level. And in this Juba case, at the society level, we supported coordination among concerned organizations and private sector users for port facilities, and Loaders Union, they are also key stakeholder. At the organization level, we supported to establish over 1 unit for operation, and support to produce operational rule, financial plans. Individual level, we invited such staff to Japan and Kenya and Northern Sudan and conducted training courses. After 1-year project, they could start operation, and now currently they are using such facilities over their capacity. Okay, so my conclusion is inland water transport can play crucial roles in post-conflict reconstruction. They can start easily operation with small inputs. Roads has some disadvantages, but IWT has much advantages in this case. And the capacity development, new government agencies have quite limited capacities, so capacity development should be paid attention. 2 recommendations. One is the role of IWT should be properly evaluated in the construction and disaster management. And as I showed, in Japan, we have some practices. And in Japanese ODA, we also have another practices. So we need some feedback systems exchanging these two types of schemes. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
That's not what we're looking for at all.
Good afternoon. My name is Vladislav Michalčík, and I'm currently a research scholar at the American University Washington College of Law. And I have a pleasure to actually present a study that was, in fact, co-authored by also Carl Brook and Ross Wolfhard. And in a nutshell, we were trying to on 7 case studies, basically identify what are the lessons learned, what could be the examples shared among what is usually referred to as a Marshall Plan. As we know, there was one original Marshall Plan that was called that way. However, we have seen a number of other initiatives that were trying to replicate in one way or another this model. And what we were trying to identify in the final part of the case study was what is the dynamics between the efforts towards regional integration and what role the natural resources actually played. Just a brief overview of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan actually lasted only for 4 years, from 1948 to 1952. There was an initial 5-year cutoff date. While all European states were invited, only the so-called Western states initially accepted, and all Eastern European, also known as the states from the Soviet bloc, including my home country, rejected the participation. It was the birth of the Cold War. The particular thing that we identified in Marshall Plan and other regional efforts were types of sort of authority or administration body. In the case of the Marshall Plan, there were actually 2 of them. One of them was the Economic Cooperative Agency. This particular agency was created by the US and was in charge of actually transferring the aid itself. However, there was also a Committee on European Economic Cooperation that actually preceded the actual implementation of the Marshall Plan because there was a requirement that the recipient states actually agree on how the aid would be used. This particular body actually evolved later into what we know now as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that is functioning nowadays. The brief rationale of the Marshall Plan was that after destruction of such a scale as was the Second World War, there is a need for comprehensive aid and for comprehensive plan. And there was also inherent logic into it to include all states so that there would be no winners and losers in this, but that the economic recovery, macroeconomic recovery, was crucial to the success. Since the entire conflict actually started and depleted the entire continent, there was a need for coordinated approach. But at the same time, the authors of the plan identified as the key element that, of course, not all states were suffering the same way. Not all of them had their infrastructure depleted in the same way. So the actual implementation of the plan was actually happened by national authorities. One interesting part was that were the so-called counterfunds. The way the plan worked was that while the U.S. provided all the food, fuel, and other commodities, these were eventually sold for local currencies, and the national governments actually had their own individual counterfunds that they were allowed to reinvest into mostly infrastructure. But again, the types and the focus of those projects differed country to country, and only about 5% of the counterfunds were actually expended on the administration costs of the European Cooperative Agency. The important thing here is to point out the coal and steel. The plan was not only to aid the European countries and their citizens, but also to prevent a future conflict. Coal and steel played a crucial role in it, and in particular the areas in France and Germany, meaning both sides of the conflict were involved. And so the authors of the plan wanted Western Germany to be included, and later actually not only the improvement of the economic conditions in the states, but also and the trust built among them, but also the importance of the coal and steel later led in 1950 to the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, which was the first of the now 3 pillars of the European Union. One more thing to mention on the types of aid, actually, the so-called technical assistance. The aid wasn't provided only in commodities or only in a financial assistance, but also in the form of technical assistance, where, in particular in the agriculture field, the U.S. experts traveled to European countries and shared the knowledge and know-how on cultivation, on more effective harvests and further technical work. I'll try to move more quickly. Before I move to lessons learned, besides Marshall Plan, there were two other cases that we identified as the so-called successful ones, where we could see the positive dynamics. The second one was Central American Commission on Environment and Development. After the bloody wars in the Central America, and after all the peace accords were signed, in 1991, 5 of them actually created this commission that initially was set up only to provide for a framework for more rational utilization of natural resources. And as two examples, again, of the technical cooperation, this particular commission oversaw also creation of the Central American Council on Forests, which in fact brought together experts from all countries, NGOs, other stakeholders, industries, unions, and at the same time, there was a later Inter-Parliamentary Commission on the Environment. This particular commission brought together lawmakers from the countries that would basically discuss how to implement the international standards, and actually even sort of a support ratification of some of the international treaties. Currently, the evolvement led to a different focus, which is broader one on not only the environment but also sustainable development. The Western Balkans and the European Union. After the bloody wars in the Balkans in the 90s, the EU finally realized that the costs are too high, the refugees, the recovery in other countries would not be as efficient and as actually sustainable unless they brought the countries into what is now known as the European Union. The so-called stabilization and association process was actually sort of a roadmap that the EU designed for the countries to join the European Union, and there was several steps before they actually become members. The most important vehicle in providing support were so-called CARDs, community assistance for reconstruction, development, and stabilization programs. These programs basically provided opportunity for national governments, but also for regions and particular industries to actually apply for all kinds of aid. While there was no major focus on natural resources, actually it was only 4.5% of the CARD's expenditures focused on environment. The European Union did support creation of what is known as Energy Community of Southeast Europe, and basically supported further cooperation among the states that would be not facilitated by the EU, but one of the objectives of the community was to support compliance with the EU policies and laws. The acquis communautaire that is mentioned there was a very important, played a very important role in a way that EU has its own body of laws, and CARDs, in addition to other technical assistance programs, were supposed to support countries in basically harmonizing their laws, whether at legislative level or whether at the constitutional level, to harmonize them with the standards of acquis communautaire. We also mentioned 4 case studies that were not as successful, so to speak, as the 3, but we highlighted them in a way that we were trying to identify what were the particular challenges or what were the obstacles that didn't lead to more successful regional cooperation. Most of them actually, even if they last, the ones you see on the screen, didn't lead to further integration. As for the lessons learned, I will try to sum up quickly as my time is almost up. We identified 3 types of lessons learned. 1, the regional approaches. 2nd, commitment. And 3rd, the adaptability. As for the regional approaches, we have seen on the cases in particular of the Marshall Plan in Western Europe and then the Balkans, and EU, that the regional approaches make very much sense and are successful if the recipient countries themselves actually feel as a part of a particular region of a group. This cannot be imposed from the outside. As for the new common political identity, there's a very successful example with the European Union, but actually the reforms and the macroeconomic recovery of the countries was driven by what we might call even a dream, what EU officials would like to say, stability and prosperity. Basically, the policymakers, the politicians at all levels were actually pressured by one way or another by their citizens to basically do as much as they can to join EU. This, of course, changed in some countries depending on the political development. However, in most of the countries in the Western Balkans, and even the polls will suggest so, with one or two exceptions, that people really want to become members of the European Union, and then there is a way to find how to reform the institutions, how to reform their laws to make it happen. In terms of commitment, this is nothing new on the horizon. That most of these commitments need to be long term. This applies to both the donors and the recipient countries. We could see the success of again the European integration. Or even the Western Europe, in a way that there was a specifically outlined plan and roadmap towards further integration and providing of the aid. And that leads me to the second most important lesson from on the side of a commitment group, as we identified it, and that's that the aid was not unconditional. In particular, the aid provided by the Marshall Plan or during the European integration, there was always a framework that was set up by the donors, however developed in a cooperation with the recipient countries in a way that from the start to finish the rules of the game are known, and this particular approach led to a success. The last lesson, adaptability. Marshall Plan, as we identified after the Second World War, or the other Marshall Plans, sometimes called, recently you might have heard, Marshall Plan for Haiti, Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, sort of echoing the holistic approach of the aid, is not a template that fits, of course, all the regions. However, it can be adopted, and there are some lessons learned in terms of what kind of measures or what kind of programs actually worked. Among them, I would like to mention the technical assistance. While we usually associate the aid or the public associate the aid with the financial contribution, the huge success of the aid in Europe during the European integration or during the Marshall Plan implementation was the actual transfer of know-how and transfer of lessons learned for particular industries, and in particular in the countries that whose agriculture, whose fisheries and environment where it was depleted or damaged. That quick provision of know-how made a difference. In particular, after the Second World War, the food was the key issue. I would like to stop there, and then I will welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
We have just shy of 20 minutes left for questions, and there will be a microphone coming around for anyone who has them.
I'm Dr. Sam. Hello?
Hello?
Sorry about that. I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet in Washington, D.C. Looking at forestry as one of the core areas for development around the globe and also to protect, as an example, of the inner waterways and food production, food security, and even power. What can be done to raise the awareness of the importance of forestry, which I think is probably one of the most neglected areas of protecting natural resources that we have on the planet?
I had a question about the Security Council sanctions. At the time that the sanctions were lifted, there was quite a debate about the timing of that. And on the one hand, there was a desire to get the sanctions lifted earlier so that economic recovery through exports could take place. But there were others that were advocating that it was really important to keep the sanctions in place until not just a legal framework was developed, but actually implemented and gotten off to a good start and so on. And so I wonder, in hindsight, are there any lessons to be learned? I mean, the sanctions regime has gotten a lot of praise for being very useful in West Africa, but are there any lessons to be learned about how to move out of sanctions regimes quickly or slowly and at the right pace, and what some of those trade-offs might be?
Hi, my name is Kelly Furr. I'm actually one of the ECSP interns working for Jeff. And I had kind of a nuts and bolts question about the rulemaking process in Liberia. And my question was, before you send out the draft rule for notice and comment, I was curious as to what kind of drafting procedure you engaged in when it comes to stakeholder incorporation. And I was wondering, did you use a process similar to like negotiated rulemaking that we've used here in the U.S. for some of our fuel standards? Or what kind of steps were involved to incorporate diverse stakeholders, and could you use something like consensus or majority rule when you have so many divergent interests? Thank you.
I have Carl Brook with the Environmental Law Institute. I have a question for Dr. Ishiwatari, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the post-conflict context in Juba made the inland water transport efforts different. So how does IWT differ in South Sudan from IWT in Bali, but kind of how did that affect the planning and implementation of the project?
Okay, then if y'all would like to start answering, that'd be fantastic.
Thanks for those very, very interesting and wide-ranging questions. In terms of the question about raising awareness of the importance of forestry, I think that's happening. I think that the connections between forests and development, forests and rights, forests and conflict, forests and climate are being understood more and more as just as these issues are becoming heightened. I think the problem is in once you've recognized the importance of forestry, figuring out how to address the issues associated with forestry. So, for example, everyone knew that forests were important in Liberia even before the war, but what could we have done to maintain, couldn't have stopped the war necessarily, but what could we have done to maintain reasonable management of forests during that time? So I think it's a key question, and I hope I'm right that the importance is being more recognized. Ken, your question about the timing of sanctions, I think this is one of the ways that it just shows kind of how idiosyncratic and distinct each of these examples are, because I and I think Lisa agrees, really strongly feel that the sanctions were very important, and I